I watched my coworker present my work, and I stayed silent. I watched my coworker stand at the front of the room and confidently present a project I had built from the ground up while I sat there quietly, hands folded, listening to my own ideas being delivered in his voice with just enough polish to sound original. And what struck me most in that moment wasn't anger or shock, but the unsettling realization that no one in the room seemed confused by this version of reality. Because the slides were familiar, the logic was sound, the conclusions were exactly what I had designed them to be, and yet my name never came up, not once, and as questions were asked he answered them smoothly, referencing decisions I remembered making alone late at night, explaining trade-offs I had documented months earlier, and adapting details in a way that made it clear he understood the surface well enough to perform confidence. And that was when it fully sank in that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-time overstep. It was the result of a slow, deliberate shift that had been happening quietly while I was busy doing the work. Because he wasn't my manager and he hadn't stolen anything outright, he had positioned himself close enough to absorb value without ever being seen as a threat, asking for context, requesting alignment, sitting in on conversations where I explained my thinking in good faith, and over time those explanations became his language, his framing, his narrative, and sitting there in that meeting I understood that confronting him publicly would only fracture the room and make me look defensive, while staying silent would allow something far more revealing to happen, which was letting the system decide whether it valued substance or performance once pressure was applied. And as the presentation continued I noticed small cracks forming, moments where confidence replaced understanding, where answers were technically correct but strategically shallow, and I realized that if I stepped in to correct him I would once again be compensating for someone else's limitations, reinforcing the very structure that had allowed my work to be reassigned in the first place. So I stayed silent, not because I was weak or unsure, but because silence in that moment was the only way to stop protecting an illusion that depended on my constant, invisible support. As I sat through the rest of that meeting, I became acutely aware of how much energy I had spent over the past year quietly holding everything together. Not just technically but narratively, smoothing over gaps, clarifying assumptions before they became questions, answering things early so no one else had to look unprepared. And it occurred to me that my coworker's confidence hadn't come from competence but from proximity, from having listened long enough to sound fluent without ever having to carry responsibility when something went wrong. And that realization changed the way I saw every interaction we had shared, every casual message asking for a quick rundown, every meeting where he asked me to walk him through my thinking so we're aligned. Because alignment, I finally understood, was just another word for extraction when it only moved in one direction, and what unsettled me most wasn't that he had taken credit, it was how naturally the system had accepted it, how easily visibility detached itself from authorship once someone else was willing to perform certainty in public. And after that meeting ended and people filed out with the usual nods and polite conversations, no one stopped to ask why I had been so quiet, no one seemed to expect me to speak, and that silence from others was more revealing than anything my coworker had said, because it confirmed that my role had already been redefined in their minds, not as a source of ideas but as background support, reliable, invisible, replaceable. And instead of confronting him afterward or sending an angry message to management, I went back to my desk with a clarity that felt almost calm, because for the first time I wasn't trying to protect my position emotionally. I was observing it structurally, noticing how ownership had never been formally assigned, how so much of what I did existed only in conversations, whiteboards, and late-night fixes that left no trace. And I realized that the system wasn't actively choosing him over me, it was simply rewarding whoever made things look finished in the moments that mattered. And as long as I continued to do the invisible work of making those moments possible, nothing would change, which meant that if anything was going to shift, it wouldn't come from confrontation or exposure, it would come from removing the reinforcement that allowed confidence without depth to function. And that decision didn't feel like revenge, it felt like restraint, the deliberate choice to stop stepping in early, to stop translating complexity into certainty for someone else, and to let questions linger long enough that they would land where they belonged. Because for the first time I understood that silence wasn't surrender, it was the only way to see whether the system actually knew who was holding it up. The shift didn't happen immediately, and that was the most revealing part, because for a while everything looked the same on the surface. Meetings kept happening, deadlines kept moving, and my coworker continued speaking with the same confidence. But underneath that surface the absence of reinforcement began to create subtle delays. Small uncertainties that no one could quite place, because questions that I used to answer before they were even asked now lingered just long enough to become visible, and once they became visible they stopped being my private responsibility and started becoming shared discomfort. And I watched how my coworker reacted to that discomfort, not with curiosity but with deflection, reframing gaps as strategic ambiguity, pushing decisions upward for alignment, leaning on authority language instead of explanation, And those tactics worked briefly because tone can cover depth for a while, but tone collapses under repetition, and repetition was unavoidable. Once leadership began asking the same questions twice, then 3 times, each time expecting clearer answers and receiving versions that sounded confident but didn't quite resolve anything. And I noticed how my inbox changed during that period. Fewer casual requests, more carefully worded messages asking whether something had already been decided, whether a document existed, whether there was a reference they could review, and those questions weren't directed at me because anyone had suddenly recognized my role. They were directed at me because the system was trying to locate certainty and kept running into performance instead. And instead of rushing to fill that gap the way I always had before, I responded only when asked and only with what existed in writing, because writing doesn't argue and it doesn't defend, it simply sits there and waits to be compared, and that comparison created a quiet contrast that grew harder to ignore, especially during reviews where timelines were traced backward and decisions were mapped forward, and suddenly it mattered who had actually built what rather than who could explain it smoothly in the room. And as that contrast sharpened, I saw something I hadn't expected, which was discomfort not just from my coworker but from management as well, because realizing that a system has been relying on invisible labor creates a kind of institutional embarrassment, the realization that things worked not because they were well designed but because someone had been compensating silently. And that embarrassment doesn't turn into confrontation, it turns into process, into audits, documentation requests, and scope reviews that sound neutral but function as pressure. And through all of it I stayed where I was, consistent, calm, and precise, because the moment you appear eager during a correction you risk being seen as the problem rather than the solution. And what struck me most was how quickly confidence without substance began to feel repetitive once it was no longer protected by my early interventions, how answers started circling instead of landing, how meetings ended with more follow-ups instead of decisions, and how leadership attention shifted almost imperceptibly toward whoever reduced uncertainty rather than whoever projected certainty. And in that shift I understood that the system wasn't punishing anyone, it was simply recalibrating, and recalibration doesn't need accusations, it only needs friction, because friction exposes where energy is actually coming from. And for the first time I could feel the system pressing against the structure it had built around my silence, testing whether it could survive without it. The moment it crossed from discomfort into inevitability was when leadership stopped asking what we were planning to do next and started asking how we had arrived where we already were, because that shift in questioning signaled that curiosity had turned into review, and review doesn't look for potential, it looks for traceability, and traceability has no patience for confidence without structure. So meetings began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways, fewer broad discussions and more focused breakdowns, fewer future-oriented slides and more backward-looking timelines. And suddenly my coworker's strength, which had always been presentation, became a liability, because presentation collapses when it has to explain its own foundation, and I was pulled into those conversations not because anyone announced a correction but because documentation has gravity, and gravity pulls its source into the room whether people intend it or not. And when I was asked to clarify how certain decisions had been made, I did so calmly, referencing files, versions, and notes that existed long before the current narrative took shape. And what mattered wasn't that I spoke. It was that everything aligned immediately, because alignment creates contrast without accusation, and that contrast made something visible that could no longer be smoothed over, which was that the initiative everyone believed had emerged organically from collaboration had in fact depended on a single, consistent line of thinking that had been quietly maintained outside the spotlight. And once that line was visible, the system reacted the way systems always do when they recognize hidden dependency, by trying to redistribute responsibility to reduce risk, introducing oversight layers, shared ownership models, and checkpoints framed as support rather than correction. But support at that level functions as containment, because it limits autonomy under the guise of protection, and I watched my coworker navigate that shift with increasing strain, relying more heavily on authority language, deferring decisions upward, asking for extensions that hadn't been necessary before, and those behaviors didn't read as failure, they read as misalignment. And misalignment is far more dangerous in organizations than failure because it suggests that success has been happening for the wrong reasons. And during that period I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not because I was being vindicated but because I was no longer compensating, no longer translating, no longer stepping in early to preserve momentum, and that absence allowed the system to experience the true cost of the structure it had built. And by the time leadership began discussing adjustments openly, using language like optimization and continuity, the outcome was already constrained by evidence rather than opinion, because evidence had accumulated quietly while everyone was focused on performance. And I understood then that whatever happened next wouldn't feel like a victory or a confrontation, it would feel like a correction quietly settling into place. Because corrections don't announce themselves, they simply become the new way things work. The quiet rollback began without anyone naming it as such, because organizations rarely admit that a narrative has failed. They simply stop reinforcing it, and once reinforcement ends, confidence without depth collapses on its own. So responsibilities that had once been centralized around my coworker were gradually redistributed under the language of balance and risk mitigation. Approvals that used to come automatically began requiring additional review, and decisions that had once been presented as settled suddenly reopened for clarification. And what made the shift unmistakable was how often leadership began asking for confirmation rather than persuasion, because persuasion belongs to performance while confirmation belongs to structure, and structure was now what mattered most, and I found myself being consulted not to lead or to pitch but to verify, to ground conversations in what already existed rather than what sounded good in the room, and that role carried a different kind of authority, one that doesn't need visibility to function, because it resolves uncertainty instead of creating momentum. And as that authority settled around me, my coworker's position began to feel increasingly unstable. Not because he had done something wrong, but because the system had finally been forced to operate without my silent intervention. And without that intervention, his confidence began repeating itself, answers looping instead of landing, explanations growing longer without becoming clearer, and leadership doesn't punish that directly. It contains it, narrowing scope, limiting discretion, reframing autonomy as collaboration until the role itself becomes indistinct. And when that happened, the final realization came quietly, not in a meeting or a conversation but in the absence of one, because there was never a moment where credit was formally returned to me or taken from him. There was only the gradual disappearance of his control and the quiet recentering of work around whoever made things function under pressure. And standing there in that new normal, I understood something that had taken me far too long to see, which was that the system hadn't chosen him over me. It had chosen whoever made it feel stable in moments of uncertainty. And for a while that had been him, but stability built on borrowed substance can't survive review. And once review arrived, the illusion didn't shatter, it dissolved, leaving behind a structure that no longer needed to pretend. And I didn't feel triumph or resentment watching that happen, only clarity. Because the most revealing part of the entire experience wasn't that my work had been taken. It was how easily it returned to its rightful place the moment I stopped holding everything together in silence. What stayed with me after everything had settled wasn't satisfaction or relief, but a different understanding of how power actually works inside systems like this. Because power isn't loud and it isn't announced, it's granted quietly to whoever reduces uncertainty when things stop going according to plan. And for a long time I had confused visibility with importance, believing that being seen was the same as being needed, when in reality being needed is what eventually makes visibility unavoidable. And once I stopped compensating for other people's gaps, once I stopped translating complexity into confidence for someone else, the system was forced to experience its own design without distortion. And that experience reshaped everything without anyone having to admit they were wrong. And that was the most important part, because no one ever came back to apologize or to acknowledge what had happened explicitly, and I didn't need them to, because correction doesn't require confession once it's embedded in process. And standing where I am now, watching work move forward without requiring my silence to survive, I understand that what looked like quiet revenge from the outside was really just alignment taking its place, because the moment you stop holding up an illusion, the illusion doesn't fight back, it simply collapses under its own weight, and that collapse doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the structure that depended on your invisibility to function. And knowing that, I no longer think about credit, recognition, or even fairness the way I used to, because the only thing that actually matters in the end is where the system turns when things get uncomfortable, and this time it didn't turn away from me.